On this very day in 1984 in Normandy, President Reagan said the following words in front of D-Day veterans, quote, "The men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead and on the next." President Reagan continued, "It was the deep knowledge, and pray God we have not lost it, that there is a profound moral difference between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest. You were here to liberate, not to conquer, and so you and those others did not doubt your cause. And you were right not to doubt." Unquote. The distinction President Reagan drew between the use of force for liberation and the use of force for conquest is one that was important not just on D-Day, but also for the Reagan presidency and beyond. President Reagan hated war. He wanted to prevent war. And in the event he ever had to use force, it would be to advance freedom and not to conquer. President Reagan sought peace, and he understood that peace requires strength. It is strength that tyrants respect. It is strength that enemies understand. It is strength that keeps the peace. As a guiding philosophy, peace through strength is as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. And our next panel focuses on where we need our leaders to rediscover and recommit to that philosophy. The Wall Street Journal's Kate Batchelor Odell will moderate a conversation with former U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Burt, who was with Ronald Reagan in Normandy, Frank Lavin, who served as Ronald Reagan's White House Director of Political Affairs and later served as ambassador to Singapore under President George W. Bush, and Dr. Matt Kroenig, who is Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a Georgetown professor. Please welcome them to the stage.
Well, good morning. It's truly an honor to be here today and be included in these conversations. My name's Kate Odell, and I'm here with our esteemed panelists, and we have the humble task of looking at the world today and thinking about how peace through strength should influence it. And I think Fred, in his opening remarks, really captured some of the essential questions about whether the U.S. has the national courage and the will to meet the challenges currently facing through another difficult moment. So we're going to try to talk about both the Cold War and D-Day as a lens to look at the world today. So I thought I would start by going down the line and asking our guests here, what does peace through strength really mean? We hear it repeated by Republicans all through campaigns. It's a Republican belief, but what would you distill the national, the essential elements of peace through strength? So I want to start with Matthew because he's just written a book that has really tackled this question. I recommend it to all. We win, they lose. And so Matthew, why don't you open us up and talk about what peace through strength means, and then we'll allow Frank and Rich a chance to get in on that question.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here. And as was mentioned, I just published a book called We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War. And of course, We Win, They Lose was Reagan's statement about his strategy for the first Cold War. And I argue that as we enter this new period of strategic competition, that would also be a good goal for this new Cold War. So I hope we can talk about We Win, They Lose later. But peace through strength was one of Reagan's mantras. And essentially, it's the idea that the United States should be so strong that no adversary dare challenge us. So it is, the purpose is peace, it's deterrence. But I think it also means that if you are challenged, you're willing to punch back. And we saw that Reagan, for example, when the Iranians mined the Persian Gulf and struck a U.S. warship, Reagan was willing to strike back, sinking several Iranian vessels. I think we've seen that other administrations have gone wrong when they don't follow peace through strength. So I think the peace through strength point of view is skeptical of kind of long, drawn-out nation-building campaigns using military force for that purpose. And I also think that it's different from the current Biden approach, which I think is excessively cautious, worried about escalation with the Russians, worried about escalation with Iran. And maybe something we can discuss. I actually do think that there is a consensus still within the Republican Party that peace through strength is the right approach, and Trump and many other Republican candidates often use that phrase. So I think that is where the party is still today.
Frank, let's go to you. Please.
Frank. Thank you, Kate, for holding us together. Thank you, Fred and David, and a wonderful day we have here today. Reagan inherited a geopolitical competition. And as Matt, I think so aptly put it, we were in it to win it, that we weren't there to survive or endure, but we're in there to prevail. And I think that hard power was an important part of that effort, and I think coalition management was an important part of that effort. But I also think there were other elements that he excelled at, one of which was communications and the moral dimension of foreign policy, that we were in it to win it, not just because we were rivals, but because the U.S. system was based on individual liberty and respect for human freedom and the democratic way of life, and the Soviet system was repressive. So we had an important moral rationale for our efforts, and we also wanted to communicate that. We wanted to win friends and allies and like-minded people through messaging, that we thought the free people of the world should be sympathetic and supportive of the U.S.-led efforts. And Reagan took that role very seriously. So all of that contributed to peace through strength as well.
Richard, please.
Thank you, Kate. I don't disagree with these two statements that have just been made, but I would argue that Reagan thought of peace through strength in a more, I think, a broader and more comprehensive way. It wasn't only military power. Military power was important, and he wasn't afraid to use it. You mentioned the Iranian confrontation at sea. I remember very clearly serving in Germany when the Libyans blew up a discotheque in Berlin, killing American troops there. Very quickly, Reagan dispatched the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy carrier-based aircraft and F-111s based in Lakenheath in Britain, and bombed Tripoli, killing one of Gaddafi's daughters in the process. And you didn't hear from Muammar Gaddafi for a good long time. So he wasn't afraid to do that, but he had a broader conceptual understanding. He knew that it included a political component, a diplomatic component, and Frank, you may want to talk in a few minutes about the economic component. And this is important because while I think he understood that the United States had to confront its adversaries, first and foremost, as we heard earlier this morning, talking about what happened 40th anniversary in Normandy, he understood the crucial role that alliance management played in American strategy. So he strengthened and expanded our alliance relationships in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East, the three principal theaters. He also, after he had substantially enhanced our military capabilities and exercised political leadership, he engaged in diplomacy, and that was part of strength as well. He not only didn't want war, but he was prepared to enter into agreements to make it less likely. So it's important to recognize that peace through strength means not only a comprehensive view of military, political, and economic power, the importance of alliance, the importance of deterrence, and finally, the importance of diplomacy, because it was, in fact, the Reykjavik meetings, the 1987 INF Treaty, which totally eliminated a whole category of nuclear weapons. And finally, his communication skills, saying in Berlin in 1987, tear down this wall, so in 1989, in fact, it came down.
Thanks, Richard. Well, a little thought exercise here to paint a picture of the world. So, inflation's running hot. American society is restive and divided. There is a public sense that perhaps the country's best days are behind it. The U.S. recently withdrew in disgrace from one of the longest wars in its history, and a communist superpower appears ascendant and is building up military force at a ferocious pace. Of course, the world I'm trying to describe is not today. It's the world Ronald Reagan inherited in 1981.
Exactly right.
So I want to ask Matthew first, what parallels are there from the Cold War to the current moment? Are we in a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party? And what similarities or core differences do we need to think about?
Yeah, well, good question, and I think there are a lot of similarities. So when Reagan came to office, there was a lot of pessimism, the feeling that the United States was in decline, a sense that the Soviet Union was maybe the rising power, that the best approach was to manage the competition through détente, kind of lock in parity through a series of arms control agreements. And Reagan didn't believe it. He thought that that painted an unacceptable moral equivalence between the United States and its free world allies and the totalitarian Soviet Union and its captive nations on the other hand. But he also thought that we had strengths and they had real weaknesses, and if we took the gloves off and forced them to compete, we could prevail, and he was essentially right. Many criticized him at the time, but by the time he left office, he'd essentially won the first Cold War. So I think we're in a similar place now. Many people think the United States is in decline. China is this serious competitor. And the Biden administration has said that their goal for the competition with China is to responsibly manage the competition. And I think that's wrong. I think we should take a page out of Reagan's playbook and compete. And I do think that the United States and its allies are stronger than China and the revisionist autocracies it's working with. Just a couple of data points. The United States is not a declining power. If you look at the numbers, we're a rising power. 26% of global GDP right now. It's our highest share in the past 2 decades. Our alliances, more than 30 formal treaty allies. Finland and Sweden just joined the alliance. So together, we have something like 60% of global GDP. Taking the NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, compared to 18% of global GDP or so for China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So I think we are in a stronger position. I still think we have the moral high ground. The ideas of freedom from the Reagan era still work. And so again, I think we should try to win, not just manage the competition.
Richard, I want to get your thoughts on the same question. Are we in a new Cold War, and what can we take from the last one?
Yeah. I don't know if I like that question, because I think it simplifies maybe to too big a degree the kind of complexity of our current international situation. I don't think it's less dangerous. So there, I certainly agree that it's a dangerous and complicated world. But during the Reagan era and prior to that, thanks largely to another president, President Nixon, and his Secretary of State, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, we were in a very interesting geopolitical situation. During our time in the 1980s, as Henry Kissinger used to say, we had better ties with Moscow than Moscow had with China, and we had better ties with China than China had with Moscow. That is not the reality today. The two leaders of China and Russia call it a relationship, a partnership without limits. So we've got a Chinese-Russian condominium, which I find very, very dangerous, and I don't know how we can pry it apart in the near term. We also face a very serious challenge in the Middle East in terms of Iran. Now, there may be some opportunities there given recent developments there, but it's dangerous. And then, of course, you've got the kind of crazy state, wild, random variable of North Korea. So it's a difficult situation. But in the end, I completely agree that we have the necessary economic strength, potential allies in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere to be able to compete effectively. But there are two factors that are going to be critical, and this goes to your question. One is, do we have a sense of of optimism of the sort that Ronald Reagan brought to politics? When we talked yesterday about mourning in America, I'm not hearing that now. I'm not hearing mourning in America. I'm hearing politicians tearing America down, calling it a hellhole, rather than being optimistic and confident about what we can achieve. And finally, maybe our biggest problem is not China, it's not an aggressive Russia, maybe it's our own political cohesion, or more importantly, the lack of it. Because I happen to believe, honestly, that perhaps the greatest source of international instability, given our size, given our strength, and given our global role, is what's going to happen to America in the next 10 years.
Frank, why don't you weigh in on the same question, and perhaps drawing on your experience in Asia, talk a little bit about the economic element. Reagan was a dedicated free trader his entire political career. What is our economic posture in Asia right now? How is it contributing to this competition?
Thanks, Dave. Look, Ronald Reagan, I think, always understood that economic success was an important building block to foreign policy. For one, you need to have the political support in a democracy for what you're trying to do, and that as long as the economy is performing and jobs are being created, the general public would tend to give you the benefit of the doubt for your other initiatives. But that was an important requirement for political leadership, was let's get the economy growing. And Reagan was very successful in that regard. You also need to pay for what you're doing. So you better have a growing economy that will allow you to undertake the activities you need to undertake. So those are important building blocks. And then, Kate, as you just alluded to, Reagan believed in trade liberalization. That it helped the U.S. economy, but it also was a mechanism for connecting with like-minded nations. And everybody in the world has a different appetite for liberalization, a different political system for liberalization, but let's work with those who we want to work with. And strategically, let's work in North America. So Reagan first articulated North American Accord to say, can we come to some kind of economic arrangement with Canada and Mexico that will liberalize and allow us to improve. Reagan also pursued other trade agreements as well. And that was generally viewed at the time as a huge boon to the U.S. economy. In my view, that's an accurate assessment. But it's much more controversial today to say trade is a good and we need to be protectionist and we need to raise tariffs and we need to watch out and the world is out to get us and we can't really make friends or have relationships. And what's extraordinary is China, which to my mind is not diplomatically agile, but China has shown greater appetite for trade liberalization with its neighbors than the U.S. has. So U.S. has pulled back from some of these trade relationships, and China said, we'll take up the slack. So I could tell you there is not a country in East Asia that is happier to see more of a China presence in its economy. There's not a person in East Asia who wakes up and says, I sure hope our country's closer to China. But China's there, and we're not there. So China's a fact of life, and we've said we don't want to be a fact of life. Now, I think we're short-selling ourselves by doing that, but that's sort of where the mood is in America today.
Richard, did you want something to add?
I just want to completely agree with Frank. I mean, he's made some very important points here. And having witnessed what happened in this audience yesterday, I can say something because it's not a question of whether I'm going to criticize the Democrats or criticize the Republicans, because I'm going to criticize them both. I think that our international economic strategy of both parties is really, really crappy. If you look at the Democrats, what you've seen in the Biden administration is adopt industrial policy. What they're doing with whether it's the CHIPS Act or the IRA, you name it, what we're doing is subsidizing and picking winners and losers. And I can't think of a situation where that's worked in the past. Certainly would have never happened in the Reagan administration. But then turning attention to the Republicans, they're becoming populists. They're becoming populists. They're playing to the audience. They're not. They're talking about tariffs, imposing new tariffs when and if a Republican administration comes into power. Well, anybody who knows that anything knows about tariffs, that's a tax on people. That reduces trade. It doesn't build trade. It creates more inflation, and it lowers people's income. And so I think both parties are playing to the cheap seats, as they say. They're not thinking about the way Reagan did of how to create wealth. All we're doing is talking about is how to shift it around. And that's not how you build strong, dynamic, competitive economies.
Could I add a note
Please,
on
Matt.
this? And Reagan was right that free trade works in general, but there are exceptions, and I suspect my colleagues would agree with me, but look forward to hearing otherwise. But trading with adversaries doesn't necessarily make sense. There's always been a national security exception. Reagan could have made money selling nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union, but we didn't do that for obvious reasons. And so today with China, I do think a different approach is needed. For decades after the end of the Cold War, we'd hoped that by trading with China, they'd become wealthier. As they become wealthier, they'd become more democratic. As they became more democratic, they'd become more cooperative. And instead, that hasn't worked. Instead, Xi's gone in the other direction, becoming more oppressive at home, more aggressive internationally. And so I do think the Trump administration deserves credit for getting tough with China, and the Biden administration, to their credit, has largely kept that in place. And I think essentially we need a three-part strategy for thinking about economic relations with China. One, in sensitive national security areas, I do think we need a hard decoupling. And just one story to show how bad it's gotten. There was an article in the Washington Post about a year ago about a Silicon Valley technology company that was developing software that would simulate a wind tunnel that the Department of Defense could use to test hypersonic weapons before, instead of building the weapon and putting it in a real wind tunnel, they could simulate it. But it's a private company. They applied to the Commerce Department for an export license to sell this technology to China, and it was approved. So presumably China is building hypersonic missiles now to kill Americans, built by an American. So that kind of thing doesn't make sense. Second, there are areas where it's not a national security issue, but China is cheating, stealing intellectual property. And in those areas, I do think countervailing measures like tariffs make sense. But then third and finally, I think even with China, there are areas where free trade can and should continue. If they want to buy soybeans, if we want to buy cheap made-in-China T-shirts, I think that is fine. So I think that there are exceptions to Reagan's free trade approach.
Frank, I'd love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. By the way, I don't think I disagree with anything Matt said, but I just would add to it, meaning you shouldn't have a trade policy that's 100% stick. Meaning you shouldn't have a trade policy that says, here's what I don't like about the world today, and I'm going to have policies that punish things I don't like. That's my view of the world. What you should do, what Ronald Reagan did, see, all that exists, and we should have a strategy with problems in the world today that is stick-oriented. But we have to say there are a lot of nations that want to engage with us on trade, on a rules-based trade. There are a lot of friendly nations out there. So you could do it two different ways. You could say, I'm going to increase tariff on hostile nations 10%. Maybe you should. Or you could say, we should decrease tariffs on friendly nations 10%. Maybe you should. But the first one punishes the U.S. The first one adds to U.S. inflation, adds to U.S. cost of goods, has U.S. steel producers raise their prices. The second one helps the U.S. economy. Now, both of them functionally do the same thing. Both of them make China less competitive, right? But one does so that is more carrot-based, one does so more stick-based. Or you could do a combination. So what I think is frustrating for me as someone who believes in trade and economic growth is to say, boy, our entire rhetoric is 100% stick-based, 100% what don't we like in the world today, and let's go tackle what we don't like. And that should not be 100% of what we do.
So a couple points that I completely agree with. One that Richard made here is that peace through strength represents a lot more than just military power. But I do think military power is a core part of the conversation, and it also informs how much of this selective decoupling we need to do with China. So I do want to ask and discuss, the U.S. is spending about 3% of its economy on national defense right now, and we're floating into territories that approach the 1930s. And when we look at Reagan's Pointe du Hoc speech, he describes the bitter lessons of 2 world wars, which is that we can't take blind shelter across the sea. And sometimes wars represent free societies that have not taken the necessary preparations to defend themselves. So I guess, Richard, we'll go to you first on this, but the US was closer to 6% of its economy on defense during the peak of the Cold War. Does the US need to get back to an adequate military deterrent of that size, and can it be done?
In my view, the answer is yes. I'm a real hawk on defense spending. And you know, one thing we forget, and this, some people make the point, and I think it's correct, that with the end of the Cold War, we historically went on a kind of vacation. And I say we, I not only talk about the United States, but we and our allies, both in Europe and Asia. And so if you look at everybody's defense spending, it declined through the 90s and into the 21st century. And we need to all get back to sort of 4% plus. And what the Ukrainian conflict for me has really been underscored is how we've let our defense industrial base atrophy. So it's just not a question of buying sort of gold-plated weapons, new naval platforms, new strategic bombers, a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and so on. But it's, we have run short, as those of you who follow the Ukrainian war, in something as mundane as 155 millimeter shells for artillery. We literally, and I say we again, I'm speaking about the alliance, we can't produce them fast enough. We have to source them from all over the world. So we, and I'm again talking about we and our allies, need to spend more, and we need to spend more on defense industry if we're going to be competitive and be able to exercise a strategy of forward defense and extended deterrence. One little footnote, I'm in the Reagan era and all through that Cold War period, we talked about a 2.5 war strategy. We said we needed an armed forces capable, we and our allies, be able to fight a major war in Europe, a major war in Asia, and a half war somewhere else, i.e. like the Middle East. We haven't talked about that for nearly 40 years. And we ought to bring that back as a strategy that is well funded to implement.
I'll follow up on that with Matthew. I think there is polling. The Reagan Institute does periodic polling on how Americans view America's role in the world, and there does seem to be public support for more defense spending, but there is also criticism about Pentagon acquisition failures, other embarrassments of that variety. And so I wanted to ask you, Matthew, about building the public case for that. I went back and looked at one of Reagan's speeches in 1983, where he really takes an extended amount of time to convince the public to go along with his defense increases and why they were necessary, and to say that behind these budget numbers is something fundamental, which is our ability to prevent the greatest of all human tragedies. So I guess my question to you is how would a smart Republican start a movement of that effort to persuade the public to go along with these expensive, large increases in investment in our defense?
Good. Well, I'll respond with 2 points. First, talking about how to sway public opinion, and then two, I would like to come back to some of Ambassador Burt's points about a two-war four-sizing construct. So I have a PhD in political science, and one thing political scientists think they know is that it doesn't really make sense to talk about a public opinion on foreign and defense policy because people are busy, they're going about their daily lives, they know they're not experts on the latest developments in the Donbass or whatever. And so often public opinion reflects the opinion of their leaders. They're looking to their leaders in Washington, what are they saying? And so I think the answer is leadership. And I think this is a place where we've fallen down recently. When is the last time a US president stood up and made the case of here's what's going on in the world, here's my strategy to address it, I need the resources to do it, please support me. But I think if the next president did that, he could bring the American public along. So I think that's the answer, not responding to what you think public opinion is, but leading and bringing the public with you. And then on the two-war, I mean, in a way, the security environment we face now is even more difficult than during the Cold War. With China's massive nuclear buildup, for the first time in U.S. history, we'll have to face two near-peer nuclear superpowers at the same time, which is something that we didn't have to do even during the Cold War. And so I was fortunate recently to be appointed by Congress to a commission to review U.S. strategic forces policy, and we delivered our report to Congress in October. We had bad timing. It was a few days after the October 7th attack, so it didn't get much attention. But we essentially called for the first U.S. strategic forces buildup since Reagan's time, and said that we need to plan to buy more nuclear submarines, more strategic bombers, upload ICBMs, build a missile defense system for the first time to deal with Russia and China. You know, past U.S. policy has been that our missile defenses are only going to be for rogue states like Iran and North Korea. We recommended that we have a system also for China and Russia, not a perfect shield, which would be impossible, but at least a limited defense. And so I think here again are some of Reagan's ideas that are still relevant. He, of course, was a big believer in missile defense, a big believer in having a strong strategic force. And so I think that's going to be an important part of the strategy, along with increasing defense spending. And I saw Wicker and the Senate called for the United States to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, again, more closer to the Reagan levels. So I think those are some of the pieces: increasing defense spending, strategic deterrence, and then finally, allies also do need to do more. And this isn't just a Trump complaint. If you look at NATO, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, came out with really the first serious plans for defending Europe since the end of the Cold War. Regional plans, they were approved at the summit last year. And all NATO countries have promised they'll spend at least 2% of GDP. But the experts who've looked at these regional plans say actually to get there, every NATO country is going to have to spend something like 3.7% of GDP. And so we're nowhere close. The Canadians, the Western Europeans, the Canadians, the Western Europeans are going to have to meet those spending targets if we're going to have an effective defense of Europe.
Well, maybe I'll ask Richard to follow up on that. Everybody agrees that our European allies should spend more on their own defense. There are disagreements about what is an effective way to do that, and perhaps not much appreciation that we did set up a system that would allow America to be the preeminent military power in that alliance. So what do you think are effective ways to encourage our allies to step up and make these defense spending commitments?
Well, to some extent, Vladimir Putin has helped in a big way, and you've had the so-called Zeitenwende in Germany. Now, that's been a little bit, I have to say, a disappointment. The German government has not moved as quickly as I hoped they would, but there is a process, I think, of a realization on the part of the Germans that they need, because remember, we forget, they are now the world's third largest economy. And so they have to take the lead. And one of the ways the Germans take the lead is together with the French. It tends to be the motor for Europe. So number one, I think the Germans have to get their act together. They're partially there, and they're not all the way there. The French have to join in that effort. They're not doing enough. The European frontline states are doing very well. Poland is the leader, I would argue, of that group, of the Balts, the Romanians and others. They feel the chilly air from Ukraine and from the Russians, so they're moving ahead. But I have to tell you, you don't get, in my experience, because prior to going to Germany, I was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe under Ronald Reagan. You don't get the Europeans, or I would say the Asian allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and others like the Australians and people like Taiwan. You don't get them to do more by threatening, the U.S. threatening to do less. What you get instead is people start to hedge. And by hedging, I mean, if you see the United States withdraw from NATO, for example, you're likely to see countries thinking about either they're going to move closer to Russia or they're going to think about acquiring their own nuclear deterrent. And you think the world would be safe with maybe 20 or 25 nuclear powers, many of them former American allies, you're wrong. It's a lot more dangerous. So our allies are going to do more if we act as good allies and we do more, because that's what happened under Ronald Reagan, and I think it could happen again.
Frank, I'll ask you a similar question about our Asia-Pacific presence. The Biden administration has not increased defense spending, has proposed a real cut in defense every year in office, but it has undertaken some efforts expanding our bases in the Philippines, the AUKUS deal to sell the Australian submarines. These seem like good developments. How do you rate that Pacific diplomacy and the current state of our Pacific posture?
I think Rick's point and Matt's point, hard power is an important component of this, and we're behind where we need to be. But I think there's also a diplomatic element, and you alluded to some of it, Kate. I'd love to see us improve our operations, our exercise schedule with the Philippines, which would be a very strong statement. I'd like to see a stronger freedom of navigation tempo in the South China Sea, and let's invite many NATO countries already participate in that, but let's broaden that. Canada's been very active in the South China Sea, so let's look at a free trade agreement with Taiwan. So there's things we can do, there's steps we can take, and if you really want to deflect China, I had meetings with the EU 2 weeks ago, and I said, what % of the German auto market is going to be Chinese in the next 3 years? And what employment is going to shrink in the German auto production because of Chinese EV imports in the next 3 years? But I said, what I'd like to see is a US-EU accord on autos. That basically any auto made in Europe, legally sold in Europe, can be legally sold in the US and vice versa, right? But just bringing efficiencies to our auto sectors would be a deflection of Chinese inroads, would disempower China, and would be a very strong signal to China that you folks aren't playing by the rules, and we're going to work with people who are playing by the rules. So we need to be a little agile on our diplomacy ourselves. I give Trump and Biden credit for the Quad and elevating the Quad to a leader's list. I think that was great. I think AUKUS was a great step ahead. So there's been some nice steps ahead in the region, but China is on a trajectory that is, they want to outpace us. And they want to have the ultimate say in determining architecture in Asia. And if we're asleep, we'll let that happen.
Well, I want to make sure we anchor this conversation in D-Day and here to remember it. So looking again at Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc, he makes a very categorical statement near the end that I'll read to you. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. Now, I think Reagan chose his words carefully, and I have to read that as a marker intended to signal something to future generations like us as we try to solve the current world problems. So I want to go to Matthew and ask, some today, perhaps on the right, would argue would eschew the term isolationist, that they simply have more realistic goals about what America can accomplish for the world. Can you weigh in on to what extent is there an isolationist current growing in American public opinion?
Well, first, I agree with Reagan that I think American engagement in the world has been good for the world and good for the United States. And if you look at when the United States was isolationist before World War II, what was the result? 2 world wars, a Great Depression. After World War II, the United States was finally willing to step up and play this international leadership role. And sometimes this period of U.S. leadership hasn't been perfect. We've made mistakes, but I think it's been the best system ever envisioned for global order. And if you just look at the data, 0 great power wars in 70 years. Standard of living, the average American is 5 times wealthier today than they were in 1945. And freedom around the world. There were only about 12 democracies in the world in 1945. Now there are nearly 100. And so the world is safer, richer, and freer today because of American power and engagement. And the American people, the average American, is safer, richer, and freer today because of that. So staying engaged makes sense. I think there is an isolationist sentiment. You have people saying, why do we care about Ukraine? Why do we care about their borders? We can't deal with our borders. You have others saying, well, we have to focus on China, so we can't deal with Europe anymore. Europe's going to have to do Europe, we'll do Asia. I don't think that makes sense. I think the United States has global interest, and we need to stay engaged to address them. My sense, though, and I'd welcome my panelists' thoughts on this, is there's always been this strain in the United States and the Republican Party before some of the isolationists today. We've had Rand Paul for a while, who's always been more skeptical. So I think it's larger today, but I do think the majority of the party and the country still understand that American engagement's important. If you look at the leadership in Congress, Mitch McConnell, Speaker Johnson, even, I think they understand that the United States has an important role to play in the world.
Richard, Frank, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, I mean, very, very briefly, I couldn't disagree with a single word that Matt said about what America has achieved by a strategy focused on forward deployment and global engagement. And there has been historically a strain in some quarters in American politics, some on the far right and some on the far left. We saw the far left in the early 70s. Now we're living through a period where the far right sort of is embracing America alone, America first idea. But I think there remains a moderate center in American politics, but it really does require leadership. It needs presidential communications and leadership, and you need somebody like a Ronald Reagan to mobilize that sentiment.
I want to turn now just briefly to the war in Ukraine, that we can discuss how firmly is the U.S. support for Ukraine rooted in the Reagan Doctrine, and more broadly, given the situation we have in Ukraine, Putin has not let up on his aims, has opened a new front in the country's north. What is the path to prevailing in that conflict and ending it on terms favorable to the United States? We'll start with Matthew on that, but I would love to get multiple views.
Well, I think 2 years ago at the start of the war, many Reaganites were saying, answer is clear, give Ukraine everything it needs to win decisively on the battlefield and take back all of its territory. Unfortunately, that's not what the Biden administration has done. I think they've, talking about leadership, Biden didn't stand up in the first days of the war and say, here are the stakes, here's my strategy, please support me. And we've been very indecisive in terms of how we provide weapons. He was against providing tanks, and then he was for it. He was against providing aircraft, and then he was for it. He was against providing these ATACMS, then he was for it. He was against Ukraine using weapons on Russian territory, now he's for it. And they've been fearful of Russian escalation, and I think there's a healthy aspect to that. Russia is a major nuclear power. We don't want to fight a nuclear war over this. But in my opinion, they've been a little bit too cautious, afraid that, because Putin's in a difficult situation right now. He doesn't want a war with NATO. He doesn't want a nuclear war either. And I think we sometimes forget that he's also afraid of nuclear war. So since we didn't have that robust strategy at the beginning, I think things are starting to bog down now. The Russians have had time to dig in behind Dragon's Teeth and other things. I think new technology like drones for intelligence and surveillance, and also for strikes against tanks, may give defense the advantage. So what the Biden administration is saying is that they envision an 18-month strategy where Ukraine goes on defense for this summer, and then in the summer of 2025 go on a new counteroffensive. The Senate could say, well, is this just an effort to stabilize things before the election and then push it off? But I do wonder, since we haven't given the Ukraine the weapons they need to win, do we need to start thinking about what does it look like if the lines stabilize along the current line of contact, and is there some strategy then to bring in West Ukraine into NATO, into the EU, kind of like we did with West Germany after World War II, and then is there some kind of longer-term diplomatic strategy to bring the rest of Ukraine into the West?
Richard, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think I generally agree. I think Matt's a little bit too tough on the Biden administration. You've got to remember that Ukraine was a component part of the Soviet Union. You've also got to remember that Putin himself could be viewed in his invasion of Ukraine as acting a little bit irrationally and wondering about whether, if he views this as part of Russian territory, whether use of American military power on Russian territory might lead, as their own nuclear doctrine says, to a nuclear response. In these sorts of situations, when you're dealing with a country with thousands of nuclear weapons, a certain amount of prudence is necessary. So, it's easy in retrospect to say, gee, we should have done more because Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons, but we don't know how, and under other situations, how he might have reacted. But I generally agree with the way Matt described the scenario. I also believe that the likelihood of an all-out all-out Ukrainian victory at this point is very, very low. And so I think in the near term, what we've got to think through is how do we position the Ukrainians? And I say, again, when I say we, not just the United States, but our European allies, how do we give them a chance to be able to go into a possible negotiation in a year or so with the strongest possible negotiating hand? And I think we may have to look at this, Matt pointed out, maybe we do have to think about this as similar to the beginning of the Cold War, where we're not going to get, Ukraine isn't going to get all of its territory back right away, but if we are successful with a Western Ukraine that becomes economically dynamic, militarily able to defend itself with Allied help, as a member of the EU and potentially a member of NATO, that over time that Ukraine will finally get Crimea and the Donbass back. So that may be how we think about this. It's going to take, it's not going to happen in 1 year or 2 years, but it may be 10 years, we will prevail.
And I think Matt is really making a great point about perhaps some of the public frustration that we see is owed to more of the Biden administration's decisions. I think you say he's a little hard on them, but perhaps it is not as revealing as a fundamental shift away from supporting U.S. allies in a fight. And on that point, I wanted to ask Frank to opine a little bit, because there is some fundamental sense, though, in U.S. society that we are culturally too degraded, and that we have real problems at home. Years of chaos on the southern border has subsumed support for immigration. And I wanted to ask the Reagan mindset of thinking about our portfolio of problems and whether there's a dichotomy between our problems here and our problems abroad, and if that should influence us to pull back from the world, and how he thought about that.
Let me touch on that, and I think you're right. That's sort of where American politics is at the moment. I just want to put my 2 cents on Ukraine from a China lens, if I may. There's a reason why China is Putin's most important supporter. There's a reason why China is so aggressively funding and supporting and providing quote-unquote non-military assistance to Russia. And China is in ascendancy. China is opportunistic, and I think at times even predatory or malevolent. But China also has a view of a risk analysis, of cost-benefit analysis. And our goal as Americans, however this might end up, as Rick articulated, Matt suggests, however this might end up, I can tell you what we want out of China 6 months after Ukraine comes to an end. We want the next Politburo meeting, the next Central Committee meeting in Beijing. We want Xi Jinping to say to his lieutenant at lunch in Beijing, you know what? Putin is an idiot, isn't he? He blew it. He blew it. He didn't have to do this. He is reckless. He doesn't understand cost benefit. And his country paid a big, big price for his adventurism. In other words, we're not going to do that. We do not want to pay that kind of price on a bet that we can grab something, right? So this kind of smash and grab militarism is not rational, but which means whatever that ending is has to disempower the worst instincts in China, right? To have them say whatever we feel about Taiwan or other territories are near abroad, whatever we might feel in our heart of hearts about that, we better just hold off. We better just hold off for now, right? Because the U.S. is still intact, U.S. defense establishment is still intact, and these folks mean what they say. So that's what we want out of this through the Chinese lens. But boy, Kate, you raised a heck of an essay question about U.S. international commitment and U.S. domestic domestic obligations. And this argument is old as time itself. And I remember complaints on the U.S. space program that how can we put this kind of money to putting somebody on the moon when we have all these problems in the inner city? And we sure have problems in the inner city. We got bad schools and unemployment and even racial strife. And how can we have an Apollo project? But I would say, boy, that's really a false dichotomy. That there is, it's not amount of resources and spending that means we might have a school system in Baltimore that doesn't do what it should be doing. It's our own policy decisions. And it's not amount of resources that means we don't have good border control. It's our own policy decisions. We have bad policies. Every nation has the right to determine its borders. We have that right, and we're not acting on our own rights. So I'm saying that's just a failure of the current administration, right? And it's nothing to do with our international posture or other obligations around the world.
Right. Well, we've run out of time quite quickly, faster than I expected, but I want to close out real quick. Thank you, yes. I want to close out with a very brief, 10 seconds perhaps, Richard, no pressure, but I do want to, I think there's an acute sense that people always think our problems are worse today than they've ever been in America, and I think Reagan really advocated that free societies can make changes, they can choose to go in a different direction. So a quick thought, leave us with a quick thought, what makes you optimistic that the US can overcome its challenges today?
I think that probably the most exciting thing about America today is The Economist magazine maybe 20 years ago did an article on the future of China and said, they noted that this country was a great future ahead of it. But they said if you really, and they called themselves the country of a permanent, the Chinese said they had a permanent revolution. The Economist, by the end of that article, concluded, no, the country that really has the permanent revolution is the United States. And you just look at the creativity in nearly every single field of activity. It flows out of the United States. And in the end, it's also related to the immigration problem. And one way or the other, we've got to find a solution to the immigration problem that does permit really ambitious and intelligent people to still be able to come to the United States and build things and do things that they can't do anywhere else on this planet. That's what makes me optimistic.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.